The topic tonight is the conscious mind in dementia. And our speaker is going to share with us his experiences in working in the field of people with neurodegenerative diseases and the havoc that dementia plays in their lives and the understanding that he has of them and the disease. So I want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Shulz. He is the Associate Professor of Neurology at UT Health Houston, Vice Chair of Neurology Service, Director of Dementia Clinics, UT Health Director of Neuropsychiatry and Behavioral Neurological Fellowship. And along with Dr. Ray Faber, who is here tonight also, he serves on the medical board of FTLDA, and we're very proud of that. So I hope you will welcome Dr. Paul Shulz.
Thank you very, very much for having me tonight. I thought I would start out by saying just a few words about my background. When I was a youngster, I thought there was nothing more fascinating than trying to watch people and figure out what they were going to do, how they were going to behave, and try to figure out what they were thinking that would result in that. And of course, years later, I was delighted to find out that there was a profession where I could spend all day doing that. And for 30 years now, it's been a wonderful experience to sit and work with patients, as many of the other physicians here do, watch them. On the one hand, you're trying to help them, of course, and you're working on the disease they've got. But as a person who's scientifically oriented, as many of you in the room are, one of the questions in the back of your mind is, well, what is going on in your brain normally, and how do individual small lesions affect what's going on there and affect your view of the world? And that's going to be the focus of my talk tonight. I'm going to give you a little background, and then I'm going to tell you about 3 patients whose worldview has changed and try to give you a sense about where they're coming from based on what you hear and what their symptoms are. You know, it was actually not very long ago that people thought that the entire brain was one equal opportunity deal where everything, all of your functions were distributed. And probably the phrenologists were one of the first group of people who came up with the idea that it might be localized. Now we kind of poo-poo their idea because they thought that the brain was reflected in the skull, and you could tell by the ridges in the skull where things were located. I was actually looking at this earlier, and some of their ideas, like concentration being in the frontal area here, is actually sort of correct, but I'm not sure that all of the other ones exactly apply to that. But they at least had the idea that there might be some localization. It was really probably some of the French and German neurologists in the late 1800s who really got the idea that things might localize to a specific area, and as a result of that, you could lose one function and everything else might still be okay. Broca, of course, is famous for having looked at patients who developed an acute problem with speaking and then following them until they passed away and autopsying them and finding very discrete lesions like that right there. Now we would know that that would be a stroke in the left frontal area. And on the left side there, you produce language, you produce the words. He was really quite interesting in 2 ways. One is getting the idea that that was where the language resided. The other is something that we kind of take for granted now, in that the problem in aphasia is not making your lips and tongue and pharynx and larynx move. It's actually a problem with the motor programs up here. And he was instrumental in making that distinction and saying they could move their mouth and so forth, but the language was missing, and that's what's up in the brain there, and it's specifically in that area. At the same time that Broca was working in France, Karl Wernicke, a German neurologist, was looking at the same issue. And interestingly, he found that people with lesions more posteriorly also had language problems. Of course, now we would call it a Wernicke's aphasia. And what they really have is a problem looking for their nouns and verbs. They seem to be stored back there. And by looking at what Broca was doing and what he was doing, he came to the conclusion that there were several areas of the left hemisphere that were involved in language and different aspects of it. So I think these 2 guys really sort of got us going on the idea that there are specific areas. And as I go through the patients today, I will be coming back to that and telling you what the areas are and what's been lost by them. The last guy that I think really, unfortunately for him, told us a lot about the fact that things were localized. And it's particularly useful for the FTD patients I'm going to talk about today, was a guy named Phineas Gage. He worked on the railroads as they were going out west. And I gather that they used to put little explosives in the ground there, and they would use a tamping iron and pound them in there. Only this poor gentleman one day tamped on it, and it exploded, and the rod went up through his head here. His skull is available, so we can see exactly where the poor guy had the lesion. It went up through the left cheek there and blinded his left eye and out the top there. People were surprised that the guy survived. And the really fascinating thing to people back then was that there was really no apparent sensory or motor or cognitive deficit in this guy. He appeared to have recovered completely. On the other hand, he really never got back to working the way he had before. And he was socially inappropriate with people and used to get into a bunch of fights and so forth. Never worked after that. And people who knew him said, well, he's really no longer Gage. He's alive, and he's doing stuff, and he remembers stuff, and he senses stuff, and he moves. But he's really not the same guy. There's something wrong with the guy, and because of that, he really was never functioning after that. His personality had changed. And that kind of gave people the idea that the frontal lobe might be doing something a little different than the hardwired sensory motor functions that they knew about already. So to some degree, it appeared that some things might be localized, and of course that leads to the idea there may be diseases that are focal in origin, and that might knock out very specific functions and leave others intact. The second thing I want to say by introduction is related to another speaker you've had here before, a colleague of mine, Dr. Eagleman. He talked to you about the fact that all of us may be experiencing the world slightly differently for a variety of reasons. I think he might have shown you this figure when he was here that fascinates me still. You can see the black lines there, and you can see the white lines there, and you can see that there's two gray lines through there that are clearly a different color. Until you take away the black and the white and see that the gray is actually, both of them are actually identical. Now, I wouldn't do that to you twice, of course, but if you look at this, you can see clearly that these grays are lighter than these grays over here, unless you take away the background and look at them again and see that they're the same. So this is really fascinating in that our experience of the world depends on our experiences. Our brain has learned to take the colors around the one that we're looking at and modify it so that we see something different than what's really there. Of course, we're born with a brain that has to learn, and as it learns a little differently between people. And on top of that, people with synesthesia that Dr. Eagleman talked about have even different considerations. This is a really interesting figure here of a guy sort of looking to the left there, until you look at him for a while and realize he's actually looking at you. It's just that he's been sort of cut in half. There's another example of how your brain is playing a trick on you as to what's going on there. So the second point I wanted to make then, number one, is that things have localization. Number two, we're all experiencing the world a little differently to start with. I don't know, for example, if what you see as blue is the same thing I see as blue. Blue is my favorite color. It could be because I see blue a certain way, and that may look red to you, and you may find another color to be your favorite color because it's different. I don't know. We have no way of knowing that. But we see things differently, and what I'm going to tell you now with the next three patients is that things can change even more so than they are at baseline if you lose a little piece of your brain to a disease. So what happens when you lose brain in a disease? Let me mention to you that most neurodegenerative diseases are actually very focal in onset, and that may not be a commonly known fact. You would think that they would affect the entire brain and everything about a person would be affected, but it turns out that Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, and the other ones actually usually start in very small, discrete areas, and because of that, you get the opportunity to see someone who has a lot of things that are normal, but they may have one thing that's abnormal related to the site of onset there. Keep that in mind as we go through this gentleman. This first patient that I'm going to talk about is an attorney who, I titled this one, You Run This Court Like a Dictator, and I'll tell you why in a second, why I called it that. He's a very successful guy. He's a trial attorney. You can tell in meeting the guy that he's the kind that would be very successful. He's he feels very genuine. He's very good with talking and so on. Speaks very well, I guess would be the thing I would say. If my mom was here correcting me. And the interesting thing is that his wife and his office manager brought him in and said they wondered if there was something wrong with him neurologically because he just wasn't the same guy that he was. They said, well, he's got pretty good memory and language. He gets, they use their own words for that. He finds his way around. But there's something different about him. Let us tell you, we've seen a couple of folks and we're not sure. Let us tell you what we see and then you tell us if there's anything going on. So they gave me some examples of things that he had done differently. Well, this is a really skilled guy, very polished guy who would never do something like this normally. But there was a couple times recently where there was a motion in the court there and the judge ruled against him. And he told one of the judges that he was running the courtroom there like Nazi Germany, meaning that he was dictatorial. And another time, when he got frustrated by what the judge said, he told the guy the same thing, and then he did a Sig Heil sort of thing that obviously would not go over very well in a courtroom, and was completely different than you would expect out of this gentleman. His wife also said that she didn't trust his judgment now when he was picking the clients that he would represent. Of course, he's on the side where he has to decide who he's likely to be able to get a settlement for, and I guess they work on commission, and so if you have a lot of cases you don't get a settlement on, you're not going to get any commission. So she said he was always very sharp at picking out the cases where he was likely to be able to help them and earn a living. And quite a few times recently, he would pick someone that other people had overlooked and said that they weren't going to take the case. And he went ahead and did it. And not only that, he would often make promises that seemed very odd to her. She's not an attorney, but she ran the office, and she said, she told this guy he would get him $1 million when clearly nobody else thought that he was deserving of a settlement period. He also started playing the lottery. And it turned out that every day he would go by the purser for their law firm, and he was the owner of it, and he would ask the lady to give him all the proceeds from the day. And then on the way home, he would stop off at different lottery places and play the lotto. And he was, he had a real system to it. He stopped at a lot of places, not just one place, played a lot of different games. And it turned out that by the time his wife and office manager figured out what was going on, they were having a hard time paying the rent, and they were like, what the heck is going on? They found in his office $18,000 worth of these scratch-off lotto tickets. There was another 2 boxes, one at home and another in an attic. And then that was just one kind of game he was playing. There was other ones as well. They figured over 6 months he had spent over $100,000 of their income playing lotto and Mega Millions and all this other stuff. On the other hand, he's still actually a fairly successful attorney. He goes to work. He's sharp, except when he says something that's inappropriate, of course. He drives. He does everything else. He speaks, everything else. But he's a different sort of guy than what he was before. In front of me there, the family was so frustrated. They said to him, your odds of winning are really low. And, he said to them in front of me, he says, they count these losing tickets, but what about the winners? I'm like, okay, I guess if you only count the winners, you probably do better than if you count the losers, too. And so the manager says to him, well, how many times have you won? He goes, well, this week I won $600, for example. And she's like, yeah, but where's the $600? He had spent that $600 plus other money, playing the lottery that week. But it was really fascinating. He's you could tell he was a good attorney because he was able to take anything that anybody said and turn it around and explain why there was a reason why this was plausible, I guess that's a gift for that kind of... He also, oh my God, this one, he got this young lady off of a charge of having somehow been involved in murdering her first child or killing or accidentally or something. I don't know all the circumstances, but the wife told me that they ran into this lady at a grocery store, and he went and said hello to her. The two of them did, and she had a baby with her. She obviously had another baby after the previous one, and he said to her that he was glad to see that she could keep this one alive. You could imagine the jaws dropping after that. And her wife said to him, you can't say that. And he goes, what? I was joking. It was just a joke. Well, obviously, that's not the kind of thing you joke about. He also told a dirty joke to a stranger and couldn't figure out why that was an issue. He did pretty well cognitively on a lot of stuff, but I want to show you one thing, for example. that as bright as he was and as able as he was to still do things, he wasn't able to figure this out at all. This is called the Wisconsin card sorting test, and the neurologists here, I'm sure, have seen it and use it. The idea here is you show people 4 cards, and they have different colors on them, different shapes, and different numbers of objects. And you hand him a card, or he takes one off the stack there, like the bottom one there, and you tell him to put it on one of those piles there according to some system, and you'll say, yes, that's the way I'm thinking, or no, you've got to find another way to do it. So you could see that with those 2 crosses down there. You might decide to put it on the yellow crosses because they're the same shape, or you might put it on the red circle there because they're both red, or you might put it on the green stars because there's 2 items. Now, everybody in this room can figure that out, that there's 3 ways you could sort this. But this poor guy could not figure out more than one way to sort it. He said there's two crosses there, you put it on the crosses, that's it. Then you say, no, that's not it, I'm thinking of some other way to sort it. And he looked at it and struggled with it and could not for the life of him figure out where else you would possibly put that. Why would you sort it in any other way? This is the way it's obvious to me, and I'm going to do it, and that's that. This is a test that is very hard to do if you have frontal problems. The ability to do abstract reasoning and to see more than one way to look at something like this comes from that area. So it's sort of a very specific test for seeing if someone has frontal involvement. This is his CAT scan. We're looking at, in this direction at his brain, but we're looking from the feet up. So this would be his right side, and that's his left side. And here we're just above the eye level, and then we're going up to the top of the brain from there as we go up this way. So this is up near the top, and this is down near the bottom. I bet that if you all stare at it for a minute, even if you've never seen a CAT scan before, you can see that the 2 sides are a little bit different. For example, there's more space over here than over here. Same on this cut. And then this ventricle is a little larger than that one. And if you go down further to the temporal lobes here, you can see that the right temporal lobe is very atrophic. It should fill that whole area there. It should fill that space where the bone is. The bone is in white and the brain is the gray stuff. It should fill that area, but there's only about half of the right anterior temporal lobe there. A right temporal frontal onset like this is very common for people who present with what we call behavioral variant FTD. So it's frontotemporal dementia, the behavioral type, as opposed to some others that I'll show you. And it's very common to see it presenting in the right frontal lobe in these folks. It's a disease that you would think would be symmetric and it would affect both sides the same, but it's not. It affects, in his case, it affects the right more than the left. And also it affects the frontal and temporal lobes and not the other 2 lobes. So it's focal in onset, and because of that, he has so many things that his brain is capable of doing, and yet one critical thing for an attorney doesn't work well at all. He just doesn't have the judgment to be able to go to the court anymore and be a trial attorney. Everything else he can do, he can drive, he can talk to you, he can give you a good argument, but the poor guy just for the life of him cannot figure out that something has changed there. He doesn't have the insight that something has changed and that what he's doing is no longer acceptable behavior. The interesting thing, I think, would be to put yourself now in his point of view and try to understand where he's coming from. And I think for the mind science folks here, that's one of the more interesting problems to figure out. What if at the end of this talk, Terry and Sarah said to me, well, you know, Paul, there was a little bit of an issue with some of the stuff you said there. I'd say, what are you talking about? I'd say, well, something you said there probably offended about half of the audience. I'd say, what are you talking about? I gave the talk. I was here. I don't remember anything like that. Well, for this guy, that's exactly what's happening. He has no idea that what he's doing is different and that it would offend anybody for any of the stuff that's going on there. So the same little area there that's involved in controlling behavior also allows you to have insight into your own behavior. And when it's not working, you don't see that at all. The toughest thing in dealing with folks like this is to convince them that something is wrong. And I've spent about 6 months now seeing this guy regularly and trying to bring him over slowly to the fact that there's something that's not right. It's really hard because you can't sort of just reason with him and say, you know, here's the problem and lay it out to him. That doesn't work at all. You have to really get their trust and then talk to them about things like, well, you trust, you love your wife, you trust her, you love your son here, you raised him. If there's anything wrong with him, it would be your fault, and you didn't raise him wrong. So you've got, at some level, you've got to believe that he's telling you the truth. And I have to say to him, I understand that from your point of view, there's nothing at all wrong, but you can take it on an element of faith here that there is something that's different. And eventually he's been coming around, and the toughest thing is to get them to take any medication, for example, even to be able to continue to stay at home and not be impulsive and aggressive and end up getting divorced and stuff like that. One of the biggest problems, as you can see, is that it sometimes looks like a midlife crisis. A guy who changes behavior, maybe goes and buys a sports car instead of lotto tickets. Everybody else would say, gosh, it's a damn good sports car. He probably just, he earns some money and he's successful and he wants to do something that's fun. And it can be very hard for families to figure out whether this is a disease or not, or whether this is just a midlife crisis or something else going on. I was thinking to myself today, and I added that last line in there. I mean, all of us have seen poor Charlie Sheen on the news the last year. I mean, I don't know what's going on with the poor guy, but something's happened. I don't know if it's normal behavior for him, or if he's bipolar, or he has a midlife crisis, or is taking medications or something. But everybody here can figure out something happened to the poor guy. And now when you see him on shows, he's getting a little more organized, as though something has changed. But clearly, for a lot of people, it was hard to figure out, was this normal Charlie Sheen, or had something happened to him? And it's the same with all of our FTD patients. It's really tough for people to have them, cross a threshold where they say, gosh, we really need to bring you to see somebody. I don't necessarily know who, but something is different there. So getting their buy-in is a big issue. And, treatment-wise, I don't have a cure for the disease. None of us do, but we got him out of the courtroom. We got him a letter so that if a police officer stops him and he gets a little belligerent, he doesn't end up in the jail. We talked to his family, and we've kept him married, which is really an accomplishment there, I think, for the whole family. And, once you tell the wife that this is a disease and he's not just being a son of a gun, she could deal with that better. And then we also gave him medications that made him less impulsive and less aggressive when he got impulsive, and it really helps a lot. So he has behavioral variant FTD. The behavior has changed dramatically in all the ways that I mentioned, and yet cognition is pretty good except for certain abstract reasoning things like that Wisconsin card sorting test. And again, I think the big thing to take away from it is that from his point of view, nothing has changed, and he can't understand why everybody's getting on his case and why people are limiting him from the things he wants to do in life, like playing the lottery and so forth, although those are very recent acquisitions of his. So there can be a change in one small area that causes all of this mischief. The second patient it's as though a brick went through my windshield, and you'll understand in a second why I named it that. This is a 66-year-old guy, very, very sweet gentleman. He's actually a former minister, motivational speaker, and he also worked in customer relations for an airline for a couple decades. I think you probably have to really have a really high tolerance for things when you're in a business where people are always telling you about problems and all that stuff. And he's such a sweet guy. You could see that he was really good at all of this stuff. But he came in and said that he'd had to retire because of some problems, and so we talked about what they were. And he said, well, I think it's my memory, because when I'm giving a speech, I'll be going through it, and suddenly I'll lose my train of thought, and I'll have no idea what the next thought is. And a lot of these speeches, he says, I've got a variety of them in sermons and all that. A lot of them I pretty much know by heart. And I'll be going along, and then I'll have a problem either finding a word, or I'll get lost and lose the whole conversation. He doesn't forget things the way Alzheimer patients do. He doesn't completely forget an event. Once in a while, he'll forget which of the 7 football games he watched in the weekend, but if someone mentions a score, he'll remember it. So it really wasn't a memory problem per se, like he remembered most things, but his concentration would wane during a speech, and he would get sidetracked easily and forget where he was. And then when he went to find a word to describe something, he had difficulties with it. So he'd lose his train of thought, so to speak, while he was speaking. He could find his way around, which is also not very Alzheimer-like. In other words, besides memory, Alzheimer's patients usually can't. Second thing is they can't find their way around town. And he was fine with driving around and all that. He could also pretty much work all of his electronic stuff at home. I use that as an assay to try to figure out what a person can do and can't do. Has to work a little harder on the controls. For example, he says it's not as obvious what all the words on there mean to him, but he works his way through it and still does all that stuff. I thought that I would show you a video of him before I show you the testing of him. I had actually originally done it in the other order, but I thought he's actually a better public speaker than I am even now with this disease going on. And he's a really sweet guy. So you won't have to see me talking there. You'll see him talking. We were on a news segment there where we're increasing people's awareness of his disease, and he was such a sweet guy. He agreed to come on and talk about it, and he's very interesting to listen to. It's just a short clip there.
I don't have a governor anymore. When something tweaks me, it's just like, it's just like a flare. I describe it as it's like I'm driving in a car and somebody threw a brick through the windshield and everything just shatters. And I'll read a word and another word comes out.
Real short clip there, but he's still, if you watch the whole thing, he's so good with words, even though he's telling you he's bad with them. But it is true. He'll be talking along and suddenly he'll forget the train of thought, or he'll use other words. I mean, he has a very high vocabulary to start with, but he can't find always just the right one. So I thought I would show you the clip before I show you his testing and let you predict about it. So this is another little neuropsychologic test that we use. The idea here is there's kind of a complicated figure sitting there. We call it the ray figure. And we just ask a person first to copy it. Just look at it, copy it at the bottom of the page there. So you see this guy who drives and talks and he's still very eloquent. What would you predict the figure down here would look like? Would he get 90% of it, 100% of it, or 70% of it? 90%? 75%? Less than 75%? There's a couple people leave that. Okay, let me show you. I let him work on this for 9 minutes, and he started out, over on the side here and says, okay, I see that item there, and I see a line here. Then he starts looking at this part of it and starts drawing upwards rather than downwards. And what this highlights here is that with the area that's involved in him, he really can't organize his activity. Even when the item is sitting right in front of him there, he can't be organized enough to follow it. And he worked really hard on this, and finally after 9 minutes, you don't want the poor guy to be frustrated about it, and it's obvious that he can't do it. So it's again, it's an abstraction, it's an organizational thing, it's a frontal thing again. Interestingly also, he talked about in that little clip there about when I get a thought, I act on it. He sort of sees what the first patient doesn't see. He sees that when he has an impulse, he tends to act on it, and he has to work really hard not to act on it. That's another part of the frontal governor there that tells you what to go ahead and act on or not act on, in addition to something like this, which is organizational. This is another task where I show him this sheet of paper and I say, okay, I'm going to show it to you for a minute, then I'm going to pull it away for just a minute, and then I'm going to ask you to draw that on your own. So I want you to look at those 6 objects there, try to remember them as best you can, and then I'm going to ask you to draw them. So he's kind of looking at them and he's working on it, and you can see while he's doing it that it kind of goes in one ear and out the other, so to speak. He's sort of looking at it and he's sort of looking around and he's trying to figure, okay, I got to remember there's this thing over here. And it's sort of like when I'm listening to a foreign language or something, I'm very bad with languages and I just can't focus on it. And this poor guy cannot focus on that. And this is what he drew. So I took this away and said to draw it. He had the idea that there was an object there and there was a triangle thing there and there was 2 things over there, and that was it. Now you could say, well, is his memory bad or is his concentration bad? And the way to test that is to go back and show him figures like this and ask him which one was the one he saw. And he recognizes all of them and can tell you, oh yeah, that's the one that's there. But spontaneously, he can't produce it. And that's how we separate concentration and memory there. He really couldn't concentrate on it enough to spontaneously produce it, but he recognizes it, showing you that the memory's in his brain. It's just not accessible to him to use. So the frontal lobes, in the last patient we saw, is involved in social control. How do I react to things when the judge gives a reading that's not what I wanted? What do I do with that impulse? Do I ignore it? Do I talk? Do I hit him? Do I do sig heil? It also does executive function, which we see in this gentleman here. The poor guy, when it comes to planning and so forth, he has a big problem, and the previous patient had a problem with judgment and reasoning, obviously. And this patient really has a problem with attention. So those are sort of 3 big things that we find in the frontal lobe. And then in the temporal lobe, which is also part of this FTD, if it involves the left side, like it does somewhat in him, it starts to affect their dictionary of words. You store all your nouns and verbs there. And when I'm thinking what I want to say to you and convey a thought to you, I have to go there and find the words and bring them forward to use them. And he can access them sometimes and not others. This is an MRI of his. Sort of like the CAT scan, we're looking in this direction again, looking from the feet up. So his nose would be here, there's his two eyes, there's the back of his head. But since his feet are out in the audience, this would be the left side of his brain, and that's the right side of his brain. The other gentleman had a problem on the right side of atrophy, didn't he? But in this patient, you can see that the left side has some holes that are larger than they are on the other side. This is a ventricle where spinal fluid is made, and we all have them, but this side would be more of a normal size down in the temporal lobe there. When you see a larger one like this, it means there's more water there, it means there's less brain on that side. Okay? So you would interpret this as meaning that he has left temporal atrophy and giving him kind of a hole there, so to speak, going all the way to the rear there. And you can see that the ventricle on this side is bigger than that, really all the way up by a certain amount. This is just a side view showing the very large ventricle there on the one side and not seeing it on the other side so much. Okay, so he has frontotemporal dementia, probably the semantic dementia subtype. It's not exactly clear because he has a lot of frontal stuff in addition to the word finding stuff. But the big thing is that same disease as the previous guy, but no behavior changes to speak of. What he has is cognitive issues, mostly attention, word finding, planning, things like that. Very different than the previous guy. Same disease, maybe the same genetic change, affecting a different side of the frontal lobe and giving you a completely different phenotype. This guy's very interesting too because he has the insight to understand that something is different, and it really bothers the heck out of him that he can't do the things he could do formerly. The previous guy has no idea that he's not doing the things he was formerly. This guy knows he's not doing it. He knows he has a problem with language and so forth, and it bothers him and makes him feel somewhat depressed by that. At the same time, he's a really charming guy still, very eloquent. And this really highlights, I think, this guy, the fact that his emotions are in place, his regulation of the emotions are in place. He can walk, he can talk, he can do a lot of stuff, but when it comes to planning and giving speeches, which is obviously critical as a minister and a motivational speaker, it just got his Achilles heel there, this disease, and that's one thing he can't do very well that unfortunately he needs. You could speculate, too, that if he had another profession, he might not have come to our office for another 5 or 10 years when something else might have happened. But he relied so heavily on language that he presented very early. I actually have quite a few ministers, as it turns out, with FTD, the language variant onset. And I think it's probably because they notice it before anybody else does. They so much depend on being able to get up and give a speech that gets the crowd thinking about what they're thinking about. This third and last gentleman says, I know that she's having an affair. This guy, I actually met him through a circuitous route. He came to my office one day because he had fallen off of his ladder and been in the hospital and had a couple of surgeries and had some hallucinations. And he and the doctors thought it was related to medications, and they stopped the opioid medications, and he seemed somewhat better. He went home, but when he got home, he was still having a problem with some things. Initially, it was actually probably hallucinations, but after that, after a few days, he really didn't have hallucinations, but he was really getting very worried about some things going on. He ended up sleeping at church one night to prove to himself he wasn't taking any medications. He started getting the idea that there was some sort of thing in his mattress at home that was affecting his abilities and that had somehow maybe been responsible for the hallucinations he had and now was responsible for trying to poison him, as it turned out. He also, as part of that, was thinking that his wife was having someone visiting her in her bedroom. He also would look outside initially and see people, but after the first few days he never saw anybody. But for months and months after that, he was totally convinced that there were people that came and were in his yard at nighttime, and they were doing things thinking that people were trying to get into his house. And so he had started putting, what do you call them, bars on the windows and doors. His wife said that his house looked sort of like Fort Knox. All the doors and windows had bars on them in a part of Houston where nobody else has anything like that, so nobody's thinking it's that unsafe or anything like that. And yet he was still completely convinced that people were coming in at night. In fact, he had started spending almost half of the nights every week in hotel rooms because he thought they were a lot safer than being at home. You can imagine what that was costing. He also learned to take different routes to the hotels and to stay at different hotels so that he was certain that nobody was following him. So he wasn't having any hallucinations, but he had certain delusions, we would call them, of things going on that he was very convinced were happening, even though there wasn't really any data that anybody in his family could apply to that. When I asked him about the cognitive stuff that we've been talking about, memory was fine. Language is fine. This guy, he sits there and he tells you all this stuff. I mean, he looks like anybody here. Doesn't get lost. He drives. He operates all the electronic appliances around the house and all that stuff. Oriented, no mood problems. Personality-wise, his wife said he was actually a little more talkative, and she actually liked that because he had always been a little more reserved. And now that he was a little more interactive, it was actually a plus. She said, but the negative is that he's gotten so paranoid that it's obviously having a big effect on our relationship there. So I'm just going to tell you that I've been seeing him every 2 to 4 weeks since last December, and the psychiatrist in the room next to me has also. And it took a long time to convince him that we should do anything, because you could imagine from his point of view, we're telling him again that there is nothing, there is no boogeyman, so to speak, around the house. Your wife isn't having an affair. But he could see that there were things in her room that indicated that there were men visiting her. One of them, for example, he told me, I said, well, have you investigated? And he said, yeah. The other night, I could see the back of a man's head in her room. I said, did you investigate? He said, yeah. I went in there and I said, what the hell's going on? And then he realized when he got in there that it was a shadow on the back of a chair that just reminded of a man's hair. And so he knew that there was nobody there, and that was fine, but he said he knows that other times there's things there. And, I said, do you love her? Have you ever seen any evidence? Is there anything that any men have left behind? No, no, no. Do you think she's the kind of person that would have an affair? No. Is she having an affair? Yes. Do you see people around your house? No. Do you know that they're there? Yes. How do you know that? Well, they leave things, and I leave things for them. He says, and oh boy, he says, I'll tell you, I messed with one and I will never do that again. I said, what happened? He says, well, I can't tell you. I said, well, tell me the gist of it so I have an understanding. He said, well, I knew that there's a certain guy who's the leader that comes by my house at night, so I left something, and he made it very clear to me I better never do that again. Now, he wouldn't tell me what it was. Clearly, there was nobody there, but there was something that he had decided would tell him if that guy was really there or not, and he was convinced by what happened. The guy had, in fact, been in there. So he was giving me a message about not messing with him. So after about 9 months, we finally got him to take an antipsychotic medication. Now, antipsychotics are very good for hallucinations. Sometimes they work for delusions. Sometimes they're not great. But it was our best bet as to what might help this gentleman get some relief. It's very distressing to him. He's a religious guy. He teaches a Bible class every week. He tells me every time I see him that he prays that God will take him because his life is a hell. It's hellacious. It's hellacious. He lives with a woman who's having an affair. He lives in a house that's like Fort Knox, and yet people are still getting in. He's having to sleep at hotels and all that kind of stuff. And you can understand what he's saying. If you believed all of that was true, it would really be a hellacious life. And I told him repeatedly that I think if we get you on this medicine, it might help. Well, finally he decided that he liked us and he was going to try it. And I saw him last week and I said, how's it going? Well, he's getting on the medicine. He's slowly building up. And I said, well, I'm really happy you're doing that because I have this strong feeling we're going to be able to help you. And he said, no, you're not. And I said, okay, I mean, why do you think we're not going to help you? He says, because I've read about these medications. They're antipsychotics. They're useful for people that are seeing stuff because they're crazy. I'm not crazy. This stuff is real. therefore this stuff can't help me. It can't get rid of reality. It'd be like saying, if I take this medicine, you're going to disappear and you're not going to be interviewing me anymore. Well, from his point of view, it makes a lot of sense. This is his MRI. He has some vascular disease, but he has the same asymmetry that we saw in the other guys. I think he's not really a pure FTD. He's got some vascular stuff on top of it. But this area over here is the area that hallucinations often come from, and you could see why he'd be sensitive to them. Delusions are a little more difficult to localize. I don't think anybody has a really great idea, unless someone knows something I don't, about where they come from. But this guy, despite all of the changes in his brain there, is still a pretty damn smart guy, but he lacks one thing, and that's a plausibility detector. He can't look at the situation and add 2 and 2 and come up with 4. He comes up with another number, and to us it seems implausible. If you don't see any evidence, it's not plausible. When your frontal lobe isn't working right, you lose the plausibility factor along with the insight, and he just cannot for the life of him see that what we're saying could possibly be true, even if he trusts us and he trusted his wife. And again, if you put yourself in his shoes, it makes a lot of sense that he'd be understandably very upset. So in conclusion, I want to say that number one, FTD is a very nasty illness. It affects people at the prime of their life. It usually comes on, as Sarah said, in the 50s. It's people who have kids in high school. They're at the prime of their career. You know, at that age, you're moving up the corporate ladder or whatever profession you're in. And it's a terrible time to rob people of their life. In addition, the really nasty thing about it is it's not like Alzheimer's disease where people get forgetful and they're otherwise the same person. It robs you of the person themselves. All 3 of these people are different, especially the first and last one. The wives are living with different people. It's not the same guy. And they are in considerable distress because of the change going on in their brain and the fact that they're therefore experiencing the environment differently. And because they see it differently than you and I, it becomes a very threatening environment for the third guy, for example. The challenge is to try to diagnose folks like this before their career is inexorably broken, before they get divorced. A lot of people use alcohol and other means as a way to get away from the terror of this. Is it okay to mention your brothers? Yeah. So her poor brother didn't know what he had, but he knew something was wrong and couldn't get organized about the world, was forgetting stuff and couldn't figure out what was going on. And without knowing that there was a specific cause of that, he ended up committing suicide, which is why it's such a poignant disease for her whole family. It's not easy for families often to figure this out. It seems like when I'm presenting these patients that it would be sort of obvious at some point, but it's really very hard to figure out. It's not like Alzheimer's, again, where people are forgetting. It's people who are pretty much okay except for certain things that could be considered a midlife crisis or something else. And on top of that, most physicians, other than maybe a few in the room here, don't know about FTD, and so it's not easy to diagnose even if you bring them into a healthcare provider. But hopefully, in this little talk this evening, one of the things I've convinced you of is that FTD, like other degenerative diseases that start focally, are an opportunity for us to understand how the brain works, how it's organized, to understand the relationship between the structure and function, what are the things that occur in each area, and by looking at what's not working in some poor person who has one small area that's not working that's causing considerable distress in their life. And at the same time, we can see how affecting one small part of the brain affects not only your interaction with the world, but your experience of the world, and causes a lot of distress in the people who have it, as well as distress in the people around them who have to watch their loved ones going through this. So thank you very much.